We've been given a very non-controversial topic of low-carb, high-fat diets. Because you've heard from 4 of our panel, I'm going to give Sarah, who you haven't yet met, a first chance to introduce herself and to give us 5 minutes, Sarah, on your pitch. And then I'm going to ask each of the remaining panel members to give us a 1-minute pitch on what their position is on low-carb, high-fat diets. And before you speak, I just wanted to recognize what I found a helpful point that Roy just made, which is the fact that we can talk about this in the context of diabetes and diabetes reversal type 2, in the context of weight management in people who have overweight or obesity, and also in the context of maintaining healthy life in the general population. So I think we slightly need to remember those 3 areas for consideration. So Sarah, 5 minutes.
Okay. My name is Sarah Hallberg, and I am one of the medical directors at Virta Health. That would be my conflict of interest statement, and I'm also on the advisory board at Adkins. I also am the medical director and founder of the obesity program at Indiana University Health. And I'm a Aspen Health Innovator Fellow. And I'm thrilled to be here, and so I have to thank both Swiss Re and the BMJ for organizing this. I think this is absolutely fantastic, and I love the opportunity to have a dialogue about some really important issues affecting both the health and the financial viability of not only the United States, but around the globe. So I'm thrilled to be here. So as far as type 2 diabetes, and I just want to make it clear that I'm going to be focusing on type 2 diabetes because that is what I do and what I am interested in. And first, I just want to walk through some incredibly basic, agreed upon things that then somehow escape even intelligent people when we move those things into guidelines, okay? And that is type 2 diabetes is what? It's a problem of elevated blood sugar. And although humans are different, and heavens knows we need to respect the differences, we cannot utilize a one-size-fits-all approach. We do have to understand that there are some things that are the same. And again, associations like the American Diabetes Association readily acknowledge, okay, in a disease where the problem is elevated glucose, that the macronutrient that elevates glucose is carbohydrates, okay? So problem, elevated glucose, macronutrient that the American Diabetes Association acknowledges is the cause of elevated glucose, especially postprandial, which we know is a risk factor for coronary artery disease. If we want to not just manage with another pill, but reverse out of the disease process, we have to take away or significantly limit what is causing the problem. And so that's why the approach that I utilize is a low carbohydrate, and therefore, because there's 3 macronutrients, we have to balance this out, becomes a high fat diet. And we have a study that I'll be excited to talk about later that shows that this works very well. Now that being said, I'm also going to say to Roy that I'm a huge fan. And I think that what we can say is that there are 3 ways that we can reverse out of the huge epidemic of type 2 diabetes that the entire world is facing. Okay, there are 3 proven ways to reverse this. Bariatric surgery, a significantly calorie-restricted diet, and a low carbohydrate, high fat approach. There are 3 things that work. And what I would love to see is consensus that reversal should be a goal, that patients should be given the choice of which of these 3 proven methods they would like to initiate and manage in their own life. Because patient A may choose surgery, and I applaud patient A that they're going to take control and do something. Patient B may want to calorie restrict forever. Fantastic. That is great for them as well. And a lot of patients, I think majority of the patients, and again, that's just my opinion, are going to choose a non-calorie restricted method of just reducing carbohydrates. And one of the main criticisms we get is that this is not sustainable. But again, we published our 1-year data, 83% still adhering. And we actually have proof of adherence through beta-hydroxybutyrate levels, which is unlike any nutrition study in the past. We always guess at their adherence, and we use the unreliable food diaries. We can show that they adhered. And we are going to be publishing our 2-year data soon. And I will tell you, adherence is fantastic. So again, I think the most important take-home thing is people have choices. Patients with diabetes have choices. They need to be educated that the choices exist and that the goal of reversal is real. They need to be explained all three choices that are evidence-based, and then the patient needs to be able to be the one to take control.
Fantastic. 4 minutes. Thank you very much. Okay, so if the other panel members, and I'll come back to Sarah for a minute as well, could give us a minute on your position on low-carb, high-fat diets. Michael.
Thank you. Yes, I'm a physician. I've been around a long time as a diabetologist, and I don't have strong feelings one way or the other. But what I recognize is that the whole epidemic of type 2 diabetes has developed during my lifetime. The prevalence when I began my career was around about 0.5% in many countries, up to 1%. Now it's running at 10, 15, Saudi Arabia 30, 40%. And that has happened because of weight gain. It's entirely with relative risks of 80, 90, 100. That is why it's happened. The mediators to get into the state of being diabetic has been driven by weight gain. And I think we now understand that the level of blood glucose, that's a marker of this disease, which is doing massive damage to every organ system in the body. And that the way to get rid of it is to get rid of the weight, as Roy pointed out, removing the head at the top. If you didn't gain weight in the first place, you wouldn't have this disease, whatever your genes. And it doesn't matter to me whether you do that weight loss using a high carbohydrate or a low carbohydrate diet, but it has to be something which you are prepared to stick into, and you must then look at the long course. And as a physician, I've used drugs, as all of us have for many years. They have covered up the disease. And I worry a little bit that if you haven't got rid of that liver fat, then you're just covering up the disease. It's going to come back.
Sarah, I'm going to give you a chance to come back on all four of these. Matthias, thank you, Mike.
Yeah, I also don't have very strong feelings for low carb versus low fat in terms of weight management. I think, as you have presented, the studies show either way would work for many. The question is, how is adherence and what are the personal preferences actually in the long term? In terms of longer term perspectives among initially healthy, normal weight, I think that's a different question. And we don't have very good evidence that low fat or the carbohydrate or the macronutrient composition per se is a major relevant factor for chronic disease beyond weight management. I think that this discussion on low fat and low carb actually a bit distracts from other points of diet quality, which are more essential in this regard, I think.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. So Jennie.
Okay, have I got 1 minute or 5?
You've got 1 minute. Because we heard from you earlier, forgive me.
Okay.
And I should, I'm hoping that there will be lots of questions from the audience in about 3 minutes' time. Go, Jennie.
Okay, so I guess I want to sound a note of caution. Low carbohydrate diets today are not the same as low carbohydrate diets during human evolution. So I am wary on the basis of at least 4 observational studies that low carbohydrate diets are associated with higher risk of total mortality and higher risk of cardiovascular disease mortality. That caution should also apply to the most vulnerable group in our population, that is women of reproductive age. We're talking about women who can fall pregnant on a low carbohydrate diet and go through pregnancy on a low carbohydrate diet. What is the effect on the fetus? So that group has been traditionally kind of regarded as a special group, and not a group that we should take into account all the time. Well, sorry, I think they should be the lowest common denominator, and we should be very, very careful what we say.
Thank you very much indeed. And Roy?
Just in general, I think a low carbohydrate diet approach is entirely reasonable, provided it's not extreme. The point we need to bear in mind is the body really sees very little of the food that's put into it. We're all hung up on what goes in the mouth, but in fact it goes into the stomach. The liver is actually controlling for very large periods of the day exactly what fat's being seen, exactly what glucose is being seen. So we need to grasp that fact, and it leads directly on to the important fact that Mike alluded to, that in fact, once you start accumulating excess fat, the metabolic factors are against you. So the approach Sarah has outlined, yes, if it works for the individuals concerned, that is absolutely fine. I would have no theoretical hang-ups. I'm coming from the position of being a practical doctor. You've got to be pragmatic. What works for the individual is what we're after. So conceptually, no issues provided it's not extreme. But remember, it's metabolism that causes the shot, causes the shots. And that metabolism gets wrong-footed mightily when it has to struggle with too much fat in the system.
Thank you very much. Sarah, 1 minute.
Okay, so well, let me just address the pregnancy one. So I will tell you that what my feeling when you put those graphs up was horror, that somehow we would see these big postprandial spikes in pregnancy as acceptable, because if there's one risk we know, it's hyperglycemia in pregnancy. So you talk about damaging the fetus. I mean, I don't think anybody's going to dispute that. When you have elevated blood sugar in pregnancy, you got a problem pregnancy. And therefore, you make epigenetic changes that we are going to struggle for decades and generations to back out of. And so to me, that graph was totally unacceptable. And I wanted to say, where's the flat glucose curve? Where is the pregnancy with the flat glucose curve? Because I want my patients that I care for who are pregnant to have a flat glucose curve. And you don't have to be in ketosis to have a flat glucose curve when you're pregnant. You just have to still be restricting carbohydrates significantly. And you can get that much better flat glucose curve in an unbelievably critical, not only for that patient, not only for that patient's baby, but what about the next generation after that? So pregnancy is so important and is going to be our key of backing out of this epigenetically. So critical. And the next thing I would say is there are plenty of studies on a low carbohydrate, high fat, and I'm happy to send you some of Jeff Volek and Steve Finney's work on this. But as far as the liver fat and the fat accumulation, the thing that's a shock to the body is a deranged metabolic system. And when we limit the carbohydrates and we can bring the glucose down, what we see is postprandial lipids fall. And we see many of these positive aspects from a body composition standpoint too. And we'll be publishing our DEXA data as well so that we can see that. Because I think it's very important. And I think that the 2011 paper that was published on this that looked specifically at this is very important, but I don't think that we should fool ourselves to think that the only way we can get there is through significant calorie restriction.
Thank you very much. So we're going to have questions from the audience now. I just want to ask, how many people in the audience would consider themselves to be currently on a reduced carbohydrate, increased fat diet?
Mm-hmm. You got them all.
Okay, that's pretty good. Well, is that pretty good? I might put my hand up slightly tentatively. Is anyone in the audience who consider themselves to be on a high carbohydrate, reduced fat diet? A few people, goodness me. And that's through just because that's the nature of the eating, or because that's what you've chosen to do for health? I will have to find out. Do feel free to grab the microphone and give your justification. So I'd like hands up, please, and I'll take 3 at a time, if that's all right. So we've got 3 microphones or just 2? Oh, we've got 3. So one there, one there just behind. Where's the other microphone? Oh, yes, just give it to someone looking attractive in the audience. And then someone else. Where's the 3rd microphone? Do you want just to the lady there? Okay. Could you make your questions quite short and comments short? And introduce yourself, Daria.
Yeah, thank you. Daria Mozafarian from Tufts. 2 brief comments. So first, Michael, I don't not believe in the calorie balance importance. It's extremely important, but it's not the solution. It would be like somebody coming in with a fever and you say, well, we have to fix your fever imbalance. We have to make you, produce less hot and less cold, rather than actually finding out the cause of the fever. So the calorie balance is important, but what's driving calorie imbalance is what's missing from calorie counting.
That's good that you listened to my talk then. Thank you, Darius.
So I agree with that. And the second comment, I think, is that Michael also said that these changes in these trials are fairly small. They're usually around half a kilogram or a kilogram, and most of these trials are about a year long. The obesity epidemic globally is from changes in the population of about half a kilogram per year. So in fact, those small changes are what is actually happening in the entire population to explain obesity. There's not massive changes going on. There are very, very subtle things going on in the population. We've, just in 30 years, we've shifted our calorie imbalance by 0.5 kilogram per year. And so my question is for everybody, but I think especially for Michael, since he brought this up, what has caused the obesity epidemic in the last 30 years? If it's just about calories and not anything about the quality of the food that's driving that imbalance, what has actually changed? Because the 60s and 70s were not a golden age of lifestyle, right? And so anybody see Happy Days in the US, right? So what has changed? And I think what's changed is starch and sugar predominantly, along with some other things.
Thank you very much.
Hi, my name is Nina Teichels, and I'm a journalist and author. I just want to call attention to the fact that there are more than 70 randomized controlled clinical trials on the low-carb diet, and that the review papers, the ones that were shown were a little bit selective, but the one by GEM Internal Medicine that was done showed that low-carb is equal to or outperforms the low-fat diet in this systematic review of all trials. And so, given that, I think that the question that I have is, and there were a number of the presenters who favored a higher carbohydrate diet or a plant-based diet. A plant-based diet is naturally high carbohydrate. So recognizing that epidemiological data is not as strong as randomized controlled clinical trials, what is the scientific justification then for supporting a higher carbohydrate diet when there is no randomized controlled trial that I know of really showing that to be superior? What is the scientific justification for choosing epidemiological data over randomized controlled trial data?
Thank you very much. We're getting it.
So, Campbell Murdoch, GP, also Chief Medical Officer for diabetes.co.uk, also work for Public Health England promoting physical activity, and for the NHS on health and well-being. My question really relates to human beings being a complex system, and I think everyone alluded to this, and also living in a complex environment. Just focusing on the human for a moment, though, we have many homeostatic systems running in us. Some of those are probably working on a local level, and some of them are overlapping across the body. One of the key areas that I think would be useful to clarify is around the first principles of what's causing the problems. And one of the thoughts I always have around obesity as the cause, and if we pick that as excessive body fat, we then need to stop and think, actually, we have different fat stores, as alluded to in the pancreas and the liver and subcutaneous tissue. And my patients teach me that some of them are fantastic at putting on subcutaneous fat stores and protecting the body, whereas others are not so good at that, and they can't mitigate their lifestyle so well.
What's the question here? Just get to the question.
Sorry, so the question is, should we be actually saying obesity doesn't cause the problem, obesity is a marker of a problem?
Very nice. Thank you very much. So if people could raise their hands and the microphone people just choose 3 other people, that would be most helpful. So we have the panel of, is obesity the cause or a marker of a problem? Well, how do we justify high carbohydrate support for that diet when there's no randomized trial? And what is the cause of the obesity epidemic? So I ask you to volunteer your answers. Yeah, Roy?
Maybe I could comment that obesity can't be said to be the cause. If we look at people who are severely obese, BMI over 40, what proportion don't have diabetes? 70%. So clearly it's not the obesity per se, it's the matter of the individual who's unable to cope with that much fat that's in their body at that time. So I think we can disentangle these two things. We're looking at a global measure, obesity if you like, but we're not looking at the individual susceptibility factors. Now, one reason we were able to cut through confusion and come to a clear answer from that first study was that we didn't look at the general population and try and work out what was causing the diabetes. We looked at the people who are 100% susceptible and dealt only with them. And that's why we were able to come to a clear answer. So we need to see through group data to understand that it's composed of individuals who don't bear any obvious external labels of susceptibility and lack of susceptibility.
Thank you. Mike?
Yes, add to that the weight loss that we found in DIRECT was able to reverse the diabetes no matter where it started. So if you had type 2 diabetes and you're unlucky enough to get it with a weight of 80 kilograms, then 10, 15 kilograms does the job. If you are lucky enough to wait until you get it with 150 or 160 kilograms, still it's 10 or 15 kilograms that seems to do the job. So what we're looking at is taking away the last bit of fat that got stored, which has gone over what we're now calling the personal fat threshold, the point at which you start putting it into the ectopic sites, developing the signs of the metabolic syndrome. So I think that's a very important concept. Shall I answer Darius's point? You're asking that wonderful question, what's caused this epidemic of obesity? Well, in the United States, there has been an increase in starch and sugars consumption. There's also been an increase, and I showed the slide from Adam Janowski, in fats. In terms of calorie provision, the fats slightly outweigh the carbohydrates. But I don't think that's the answer either. I think the answer lies in this extraordinary change in our behaviors. And I mentioned the eating between meals, the snacking, the fact that you can buy snacks in laundrettes and petrol stations. And, you know, it's an extraordinary change in a whole species. Behavior has been enacted through clever marketing. I mean, the marketing companies have been very, very clever, and they're very effective. And they have led us to eat more of these foods. There is also this issue which, in animals, if you give experimental animals a sweetened drink, it doesn't have to be sugar, it can be artificially sweetened, they will automatically go and look for more sweet foods to eat as solid foods. And you know, if you've got this profusion of sweetened foods, and of course you don't eat starch and sugar, they taste horrid. You have to mix them up with some fat to make them palatable. It works both ways. But if you give people nothing but, and I have many people in the west of Scotland, there's a line in Scotland that goes through Motherwell, and we call it the iron brew line, because on the west of that line, people they don't drink anything except iron brew. And they are exposed to this sickly sweet stuff from childhood onwards. And they are driven to eating more snacks than the right-hand side, the east side, which is where we drink tea.
And Mike, in response to Nina's point about the high carb, what's the justification for
I kind of lost the point here, but I think Matthias had an answer
Matthias,
to that.
yep.
Yeah, I also did not completely understand the question.
As I understand it, but Nina, tell me if I'm wrong. They were basically saying that there's no randomized controlled trial of a high-carb diet. So on what basis can one justify? Have I got that right?
There are randomized trials comparing low
Nina,
carb and low fat diets. So I think that's not the issue. You can lose weight on both diets, I think.
There's so much evidence for low-carb diets in terms of being preferable for weight loss and also clearly for diabetes reversal. So
for diabetes?
What is, yes, diabetes. Well, Sarah Hallberg's study showed diabetes reversal on a low-carb diet. So 60% of the population reversed their diabetes in 1 year with 84% adherence. So what's the
randomized trial?
In a controlled clinical trial?
It wasn't doing it.
It was a controlled clinical trial. Well, Sarah should speak to it herself.
I'll be happy to. And the interesting thing about our trial that we published the 1-year data and are about to publish the 2-year data is it was not randomized, it was controlled. And it's because we wanted to make it real life applicable, and we wanted people to be able to choose. Now, you say randomization, lack of randomization is a decrease in the quality of the study. Aha, I will argue with that. Because ours is the first nutrition study where we can prove people stuck to it. We eliminated what was their food journal, you know, these unreliable food journals. We checked beta-hydroxybutyrate regularly on these people, so we can confirm adherence to this dietary intervention.
You could have checked that if they'd been randomized too.
I'm sorry, what?
You could have checked that if they'd been randomized as well.
Well, so again, randomization, and I know Laura Saslow is in the audience, so her study is a perfect example of one of the problems with randomization, in that people come in knowing they want to do a low carbohydrate diet because they see people that it works. And when you randomize them to the low fat arm, what happened right away in the trial? People dropped out. And so we were trying to do a good quality study where we believe, and I mean, again, I will argue this with anyone, which is that the ability to acknowledge and prove adherence is much more important than the lack of randomization. But the other thing I want to point out from our study too is that our average time with diabetes was 8 years. Okay. And in fact, on other studies, much more recent diagnosis, and they exclude insulin. And a huge percentage of our patients came to the study on insulin, and diabetes up to 20 years.
Thank you.
So we took sick people.
Mike, your response to that?
Yeah, I was just going to say a couple of things. Measuring ketones has become popular. your ketones go up if you're losing weight. So this is a completely circular argument. Whatever diet you're on, if you're losing weight, you'll get ketones. And the other thing is that the evidence on the high carbohydrates, and you notice from the show of hands, there's actually nobody who thinks they're on a high carbohydrate. I don't know what a high carbohydrate diet is, but Jim Mann and his colleagues way back in the 1980s, Gabriele Riccardi, did a series of studies in competition with Jerry Reven, because Jerry Reven was telling us that high carbohydrate diets cause all the adverse effects you can imagine. They get more diabetes, their triglycerides go up. And yet, when they were done in Oxford or in Italy, opposite results. Everything got better, including the triglycerides. And the difference was that they were completely different diets. The American-style high-carbohydrate diet was, of course, and probably still is, full of sugar and the refined things that Darius is speaking about. Whereas what the Italians were looking at and what we were looking at in the UK was a diet with a lot of natural fiber, with a lot of legumes, and you can go up to 60 or 70% carbohydrate. So what we're going back to is glycemic load. And it doesn't matter if you reduce your glycemic load by cutting carbohydrate, that's fine, and there's somebody who's done it over here, that's fine. But an alternative way of doing that is to mix it with other foods, as I mentioned on the slide, and you reduce the glycemic load that way, or by having a lot of legumes.
Right, and I said
hang on, Sarah, hold your fire.
Is, but can I just make one point?
No, hold your fire. I'm going to give wherever our 3 microphones, just give me a sense. Who's got the microphones? One there. Where's the third one?
I conquered the microphone in the first round.
Okay,
So.
Asim.
One quick point and then a question
Just
related
say
to
who
it.
you are, please.
Asim Malhotra, a consultant cardiologist. So just supporting what Darry and what Mike has said, when you look at the issue of ultra-processed foods, 50% in the UK of consumption is ultra-processed food linked to obesity. A recent publication, the BMJ, linked ultra-processed food to cancer independent of BMI. You look at the makeup of that ultra-processed food, it's coming from starch, sugar, sugary drinks, ultra-processed fruit and vegetables. 70%, 77% of the ultra-processed food is coming from that. So the starch and sugar is a major issue. In relation to that, and the question to the panel here, there's one thing that's a real bugbear for me. We know obesity is a major issue, but the bigger issue is the insulin resistance syndrome, metabolic syndrome. And some studies suggest up to 40% of people with a normal BMI have metabolic syndrome or markers of metabolic syndrome. A third of people with type 2 diabetes in UK PDS had a normal BMI. Can we have a consensus of agreement today that there is no such thing as a healthy weight and only a healthy person?
Interesting. Hold on, I just want to wear our second microphone. Sir, could you
My
say
name
who
is
you are?
Martin Kussmann. I work at the Liggins Institute at the University of Auckland. That's if you drill a hole here and come out on the other side. We are working on perinatal nutrition and health, and I wanted to I want to make 3 remarks. First, I want to support Jennie's remark that I think we can only win the race against obesity and diabetes when we think about prevention. Especially when you look at the limited success in intervention studies in adult populations. So perinatal nutrition is key, avoiding gestational diabetes is key. The second remark I would like to make up for discussion is about evidence, and that relates a little bit also to the previous panel. I think we are facing the issue that we have a broad range of differently designed studies that are still mostly carried out in Caucasians. So rather than doing different studies in the same population, we should do the same studies in different populations that we can compare them and assess their relevance for ethnicity. And the third quick remark is about relevance. We were discussing going back to organically grown food and the luxury of having gardens in Northern California and maybe Switzerland. Whether we like it or not, 80% of the world population will soon live in mega cities with more than 10 million inhabitants. So if we don't bring the solutions into these cities, it's statistically irrelevant.
Thank you for that. And the third microphone is with someone there.
I'm Dr. Mark Hyman, the director of the Cleveland Clinic Center for Functional Medicine, and I found it very interesting that in a group of very educated people about nutrition, most of us preferred a higher fat, lower carb diet, and only one person was on a low fat diet. I think that speaks a lot to what we think, not necessarily what we say or do. And the question is, the UN FAO did a survey of many countries and consumption patterns, and for every 150 calories of increased food, there was a 0.1% increase in type 2 diabetes. But if that 150 calories came from soda, there was an 11-fold increase in type 2 diabetes. So how does that sync with the idea of energy balance and that all calories are the same?
Okay, So back to the panel. I'm not sure I can summarize all of those, but no such thing as a healthy diet, only a healthy person. A number of comments about different populations needed, perinatal, and the question of the different studies combining, and the point that was just made, which my brain has completely immediately forgotten, but someone, Mike.
I can probably deal with, I can deal with that.
Oh, exactly, sorry.
That one's easy. That's the point there is that the association between the sugar-sweetened beverages and weight gain is much greater than any individual nutrient. And so you've just said what we, I think, already know. Azim asked about, is there an ideal weight? Well, there is an ideal weight. It's whatever weight for you individually, and it's different at a different age for all of you before you get metabolic syndrome and type 2 diabetes. And you have to be aware of this. There isn't a single figure worldwide. We can't apply BMI 25 or BMI 30 were epidemiological. Yeah. And incidentally, I got the same text message from a patient who'd become non-diabetic on a meat-eating diet, word for word as the one you got.
Anyone, Jennie, you haven't spoken, anything you'd like to add at this point? Or?
Only a small comment. Kevin Hall's papers show that the actual excess calories that are needed to gain weight and explain our obesity epidemic are very small. 7 excess calories a day over the course of 10 years explains the obesity epidemic. So calories, in my mind, are not that important. What is important is the quality of the diet. But I'd just like to say something else. There's a lot of demonization of processed foods, refined foods, the food industry going on. But if you go back 40 years, which is when I started in this game, the food industry was told that there was a shortage of food, a shortage of protein and a shortage of food. And so the food industry rose to the call and said, okay, we'll produce lots of foods, we'll increase the yield. They did exactly what we wanted. And they produced safe, cheap, palatable food. So in my mind, we just got too much of a good thing. And now we need to control ourselves.
I think we have to say the snacking and the marketing, and there's a whole host of other stuff going on, isn't there? But I take the point. Roy.
I just comment on Asim's point about where's the insulin resistance syndrome, what's going on here. Just commenting on insulin resistance, it's often viewed as a pathological entity, whereas in fact, we don't have insulin resistance. That's a concept in the mind of man. The thing in the mind of God was the insulin sensitivity, which is the reality. And that's something which is evenly distributed in the population. So if we look at the less insulin sensitive portion, yes, there's a lot of problems there. And so if we were to consider those people who have insulin resistance in muscle, that's the genetically inherited form, tends to run in families naturally, and can only be changed marginally, those people are specifically disadvantaged with a high carbohydrate diet because we know from our work following food with magnetic resonance spectroscopy that they can't store glucose as glycogen in muscle immediately after meals. They have to have a bit of a boost in their de novo lipogenesis. So if we were to identify those people, we could perhaps follow through prospectively and actually test what I'm saying, which is only putting together notions. So insulin resistance, well, let's flip it on its head and say what's real, which is a biological variation of insulin sensitivity in muscle. And yes, there is a problem at the low insulin sensitivity range.
Thank you. Sarah, did you want to add
Well, I want to put one thing about ketones. So ketones will rise in starvation. They don't rise with weight loss. There's no data on that. And so our elevated beta-hydroxybutyrate that was over twice what we see in the average population is a significant marker of adherence. Again, and I'll just stress that I think puts that study above others that rely on food diaries. So,
Thank you.
And now I'm done with that point.
Thank you very much. So who's got the microphones this time? There's one over there. If you could raise your hands, and the microphone people will know to come to you. But sir, you first, please.
A retired GP from the UK. with an interest in nutrition. It's just that I've always been taught that Asians who have a high carbohydrate diet then come to the UK or the West, and then they get diabetes because they have more meat and more protein and more fat. And I'm surprised to see this revival of the Atkins-type diet, because we know that the Atkins-type diet increases cardiovascular disease, gallstones, kidney stones, osteoporosis, and cancer.
Thank you very much for that.
Based on what data?
Hold on a second. Other microphone. We'll get to that. Sorry, I'm trying to look
over here
for the... Oh, yeah, go.
So, Naveed Sattar again from Glasgow. So I grew up...
Sorry, just introduce yourself again.
Naveed Sattar from University of Glasgow. So I work with Mike, so I'm fortunate, and Roy. So I grew up in Blantyre, which is near Motherwell, and Iron Brew is from Blantyre, apparently. So I grew up drinking lots of Iron Brew, but I went to medical school. I was eating lots of chips, and I don't have a low carbohydrate or a low fat diet. But what I did was change my habits, retraining my taste buds to get rid of sugary drinks. Don't eat chips as much anymore, still eat the occasional ones, but I've now made proper choices. So it's neither one or the other. And I think most people in our community don't need to choose if they want to stay healthy and not become overweight. They don't need to choose one or the other. I think we're talking more about weight loss in people who are obese in terms of trials, and that's a different question. So we've got to be really careful when we actually look at this. So, and I think the key concept, and I do clinical practice, for many of my patients, for some of them it's clearly, we had one guy who was drinking 8 litres of Iron Brew a day and 2 packs of crisps. Now, he lost 8 kilograms when he started to go on to a normal diet. Most of my patients, so it's snacking culture.
Yes.
It's crisps, it's biscuits, it's cakes, which contain lots of saturated fat and excess refined sugar. And it's a combination of things. And the key thing for them is to retrain this taste buds. And I'll give you one last example. So one patient, I said, could you go and try some fruit? He came back next week, he said, Doc, I tried that banana, it's bloody horrible. It was the first banana, and this is the reality, it's the first banana he ever tried.
So it seems to me no chips, no sweetened drinks is a Scottish low-carb diet, is that right?
No. So the point is, it's neither one or the other.
But I take the point, it's normalising things.
Yeah.
And there's a third microphone somewhere. There. Oh, so sorry, you've got a microphone. Yeah, go ahead.
Hello, my name's Jane Collis. I've been studying diabetes for 50 years, even though I'm only 23, 20 of which I've been observing pregnancy and lipids, and I've got an interest in various aspects.
Just bring the microphone close.
Sorry, various aspects of diabetes. I agree totally with the ladies talking about pregnancy. We've forgotten homeostasis altogether with fats. The quality of the fat matters. We can't go frying a fat and expect it not to cause damage to our body. So with polyunsaturated oils and olive oil, they're cold pressed. So unfortunately, when they're offered to us, they're very old. Sometimes rancidity is covered by commercial processing. So in effect, we're putting something pro-inflammatory into our bodies, which affects the testes and the ovaries. And also, when the baby is growing, if you should be so lucky to get pregnant with an unbalanced homeostatic function with your omega-3 and 6, then the baby will pinch all the omega-3 from the mother, and that's essential for insulin sensitivity. So therefore, the baby might stop growing or die. And, nobody's looking at this. I'm very glad to hear somebody's talking about pregnancy.
Thank you very much.
Excuse my nerves.
No, you've done brilliantly. So we've got the Atkins diet, which was said, and we wanted to know the evidence for this, that it increases a whole load of terrible things, and why the Asian population changed their profiles in coming to the UK. We've got the business about just simply stopping the bad stuff and getting back to what in Scotland might be considered a more normal diet, and then the rancid fats and all the problems of pregnancy. So who would like to take any of those? Sarah?
So I'll start out. So as far as the Atkins diet, none of that is true. There's not evidence for that. But more importantly is, I agree here with, I think both of you brought up the idea of health, right? And what is a healthy diet? And I couldn't agree more that if we look at different cultures, right? Let's look at some cultures around the world, what we see is that there's a continuum that people can exist on and be healthy. We have island nations who are very high carb, who have very low incidence of heart disease. We have the Inuits and the Maasai who have incredibly high saturated fat intake, and they are free of heart disease and healthy as well. And so humans can exist on this continuum very happily until we introduce things that I believe that we all can agree on, sugar, processed foods, and once you do that and you get a metabolically unhealthy person, there's no continuum anymore. You have to shift down to the low carbohydrate end of this continuum, and whether you get there through significant calorie restriction or you just limit carbohydrates, once you have metabolic illness, your choices are limited.
Thank you for that. Other comments on the panel? Roy?
That just raises an interesting point that Sarah's made, that the way out of a problem is not necessarily exactly retracing your steps. And reflecting on the question about the South Asians moving to Britain, it wasn't that Britain was such a horrible environment, it was actually an affluence effect. And so you saw exactly the same had rural Indians moved to urban centres, and that effect was reproduced, for instance, by George Alberti looking at Tanzania. Rurals moving to the town, they became more affluent and they could afford more food. And as I mentioned, what superimposed on the typical Asian diet was the increased fat, and of course meat, that they could afford. So they actually put on the weight and the poor old body was disadvantaged. How you get out of that situation is a separate question. And the approach of reducing the carbohydrate for that person would be entirely reasonable.
Matthias.
Maybe I can add to that. I mean, the issue of nutrition transition in many countries is a major one, but it's, I think we have sometimes the idea that traditional diets are all good, but in many societies or many countries, traditional diets are relatively poor and have little diversity, actually. And what we also do observe is that increasing diversity, even if this means you start to eat little red meat, that is counterintuitive, but it actually could be beneficial.
Thank you. Jennie, what about the question about pregnancy and the rancid fats and the issue around protecting the fetus? And
Oh, I think the idea that rancid fats are dangerous is perfectly reasonable. We don't want to eat oxidized food at all, whether it's fat or any kind of oxidative products.
Thank you for that. And Mike, do you want to answer the business about the Scottish diet and just getting people off the bad stuff onto a more normalised?
I'll tell you, yes, I'll give you one. In fact, I like volunteers from this room. I have a student who's trying to find people on low carbohydrate diets, and he's been collecting hundreds of them from the internet and from Facebook and such like. And suddenly, but when you actually find out what they're doing, they aren't on low carbohydrate diets at all. They just thought they were. So I wonder what you guys are doing.
Okay, I've got 3 microphone people, but the comment, if the next microphones could come to the front of the room, I'd be grateful. So the lady there with the microphone, yeah. Go ahead.
My name's Rachel Stockley. I'm a GP working in Brussels with English language expats who are mainly working in the European institutions, embassies and NATO, very highly educated, go onto the internet all the time about what they should and shouldn't be eating. So my question is to the panel is the influence of food processing in the carbohydrates and fats that people are eating. Do you think that there is a connection between the actual levels of food processing and chronic disease, the impact of the way the food is put together or deconstructed and then put together again in some of these ultra-food processed foods? And do you think that we should be influencing food makers and providers with an index that is categorizing food according to the degree of food processing?
Very nice. Thank you very much. If that microphone could come up the front here. And the lady there, yes, thank you.
Sorry, just to
introduce yourself, Barbara, just say.
So I always used to give patients a choice with difficult treatments.
Sorry, just say your name again, Barbara.
Barbara Boucher, Queen Mary's, London. Maybe you've mentioned it and I've missed it, but are there any simple crossover trials of high-fat and high-carbohydrate diets? Which do patients prefer? Which do they find easier to stick to? And can you find any characteristics to predict which you might recommend first to a patient?
Great question. Ian.
Oh, great, thank you. My name's Ian Lake. I'm a medical advisor to diabetes.co.uk. I'm a humble GP in search of the truth and a type 1 diabetic, so I choose a ketogenic diet. My question really is that if you look at most trials regarding carbohydrate and fat, most of the trials on fat are done on in an environment of about 30% of the carbohydrates, 30% of the energy coming from fat. And what seems to happen is that the ratio of the fats are changed within that 30%. And then people are given a 24-hour recall sheet, a dietary recall sheet every year or so, and conclusions are drawn from that. A lot of carbohydrate gets converted to fat. In fact, most of us here are probably converting our excess carbs into fat now. And that fat, of course, is saturated fat. So I think and most of the diets that I've looked at regarding low carbohydrate in diabetes stick at about 40% of the carbs coming from fat, 40% of the energy coming from fat. So I think if I was on a high carbohydrate diet, I'd take a lot of care with my saturated fat, because the saturated fat that comes from carbs, I think, is highly significant in this. And of course, the saturated fat from carbs is tagged with B100, which is quite a highly significant factor in cardiovascular disease. So that's my question. Should we take those into account?
Could that microphone just come here to Salim, and then we'll just have answers to those three, which were about the importance of food processing. Oh, well, no, hang on a sec, Walter. I'm just going to come back to the panel, and then I'll get you in. So, food processing, could we get a measure of that, get the food industry to abide by that? Has there been a crossover trial between high fat, high carb? Which do patients prefer? Which is easier to stick with? And the business about saturated fats that the body develops as a response to eating carbohydrates, and how do we balance that out? Roy.
Just a comment on the processing of food. There might be many details that may or may not be deleterious, and that would require a lot of studies to sort out. But the huge elephant in the room is the added sugar to processed meals. If you go into a high street shop anywhere and actually read what's been added in the way of sugar, it's positively alarming. And of course, this is done to improve taste and improve the chance of the consumer coming back and buying more. But in fact, we know from the very old experiments that if you add sugar in a covert way, it doesn't actually change perception of satiety. So the problem with processed ready meals is not so much the mechanism of processing, but this huge matter of added empty calories, which aren't registered by appetite as having gone in.
Thank you. Jennie.
Can I just put some facts in there? If you look at the FAO, WHO website, fantastic, you can plot the UK intake of sugar from 1961 all the way up to 2014, and it shows a steady decline, comparable to the decline in Australia in the intake of added sugars. 50 years ago, Mum bought a packet of sugar and she made cookies and cakes and cordials. Today, the food industry makes them. And the food industry has allowed a whole generation of women to go out to work and to have careers.
Right.
The problem is the structure of the population. We won't disagree on that. What's happened over a couple of generations in Britain is added sugar you sprinkle on or cornflakes, add to your tea, has actually gone down markedly and has been replaced by the processed food. Now, the children really get that whack, whether it's added in the sweet and sour chicken from Marks and Spencer's, that leads the league of added sugar products, or whether it's added in Iron Brew. It really doesn't matter. So we've got a real problem with our alarming epidemic of obesity in children.
Sarah, can I ask you about this crossover between high fat, high carb? Have there been, or does anyone know of any comparisons about acceptability of those two diets? Jennie or Sarah?
What's Iron Brew? Can someone answer that question for me first? Is it soda? Is it just soda? Okay,
Yeah.
All right. Sorry, I had to be educated on that one. So there are a number of trials that compare low carb and low fat.
Or high carb and high
excuse
fat.
me, low carb and high carb.
Yeah.
And what we see over and over again is that from a metabolic standpoint, the low carbohydrate outperforms the low fat diet time and time again. And those results are much more striking when we look at diabetes.
Okay, briefly, if you would, Mike.
Can I pick up Barbara's point, though, was on individual preferences here. And if you ask people to go on a diet which they don't like, then they're unlikely to stick to it. And so this is where it comes back to the N equals 1 or N of 1 randomized trials, which the BMJ first kind of announced to the world about 30 or 35 years ago. And there's now, in addition to the consort program, I don't think it's ever been used.
Okay, thanks. Jennie?
CSIRO in Australia have done a lot of studies on low carb versus low fat. They're parallel, they're not crossover, and they have long term, they're 2 years, and they've looked at mood and depressive symptoms on each diet, and the low carb diet is associated with more negative mood. Even though they've lost all that weight, they don't feel as happy as the people on the high carb diet.
Interesting.
Comment on that? That depends on the definition of low carb, because that's actually the opposite of what we see in real low carb.
Okay.
75 grams. 75 grams of carbohydrate.
We've got literally less than 5 minutes. I'm going to just ask for the final 3 microphone people, just you can have a 10-second comment. Sorry, Malcolm.
Okay. This has Will at Harvard, Boston. This has to be a question, I guess. Is there really any reason that plant-based diets need to be high in carbohydrate? I find it pretty easy to have plant-based with lots of vegetables, olive oil, nuts, seeds. And also Cordain, the founder of the paleo diet, was asked how many people in the world could be supported by that paleo-type diet. His answer was about 200 million people. And so my question is, where's the other 7 billion going to go? As someone mentioned, we need to think about the environmental consequences.
Thank you. Salim, very briefly, if you would.
The North Star in this conversation is higher weight is bad for you. That is, a weight over 25 BMI is worse than below or in the 23, 25, and over 30 is bad. There are 3 sets of good data that challenge that. First, a paper in the Lancet Global Health that came out late last week or early this week on 500,000 people followed for 16 years from India that shows that mortality is lower with higher BMI with no threshold.
With lower BMI?
No, with higher BMI.
Mortality
is lower at higher BMI all the way up to 35. That Richard Peto is the senior author on it. Gajalakshmi did it.
Briefly,
second thing is in Denmark, the BMI associated with the lowest mortality has been going up by 2 units every decade. Item 3, the tons of paper on the obesity paradox. The sicker you are, the higher your BMI, it protects you. What this means is there's something about BMI, despite the fact you get more diabetes and higher blood pressure, that is counteracting it and protecting you. So going back to, I think, Asim's comment, people matter, BMI doesn't matter.
Thank you for that. I'm sorry, the final microphone person. Oh, if you can be so short, I mean, like a microsecond. Oh, no, sorry, it's behind you. Sorry, sir, behind you.
Thank you. My name is Sinan Mir. I'm a GP from London. Just to keep it exceptionally short, in the context of talking about either decreasing calories, caloric restriction from a thermodynamic point of view, or metabolic hormonal imbalance. In the context of diabetes especially, where does the panel, and this is for the whole panel, where does the panel sit on therapeutic fasting? That's not been mentioned here. Is that appropriate? Is that relevant? Is it a sustainable model? So fasting, whether it's sort of a 5-2 model or a 16-8 model, is that something that is a feasible approach to decreasing weight and managing glycemic control?
Thank you very much. Will you let me give the panel just 30 seconds each, because I want to get a sense from you of where you think the agreement is between you, on this issue. I'd like to give 1 or 2 points where we think we've got agreement. Sarah.
I think the agreement here is that reversal is possible, and I think that we need to come to a consensus and make a strong statement about that so that we can give patients a choice. We need to put power back into patients' hands, because I'll point out Walter's comment. You can absolutely do a plant-based, low-carbohydrate, high-fat diet, and if that's their choice, we need to all surround them and support them for that, right? Because there is more than one way to skin a cat. 3 ways have been scientifically proven to reverse type 2 diabetes. We need to talk about it and give people the option.
Thank you very much, Mike.
I'd just like to take a moment. So it's Salim Yusuf's interesting comment here. One of the weird things is that a body mass index of under 25 is only found in 11% of people in Scotland when they reach the age of 65. So we're weird. We're weird. Thin people are weird. Most people are healthy, have gone with the population.
Where's the agreement, Mike, where in our conversation?
I think the agreement lies that a glycemic load, high glycemic load, however you get a high glycemic load, is bad for you, and there's many ways of avoiding it.
Thank you. Matthias.
Along this line, like plant-based diets would be the go for, and they could have a range of carbohydrate versus fat. I would
Thank you, Jennie.
High glycemic load diets are bad for us. I would agree that a large amount of weight loss, of at least 10 kilos or 10% of body weight, is associated with remission of type 2 diabetes, but the next question is, for the rest of their life, which is the best diet composition?
Thank you. Roy.
And agreeing with all the previous points, the individual nature of this, in other words, the human interface with the science we've been talking about, is really important to recognise. So no one size fits all.
Fantastic. Thank you to our panel. Thank you to the audience for their questions.